Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is going to be another intro to React series I'm going to do. The reason I'm doing this one is because a React 18 was just released, and there are some changes that make worth redoing sort of like this intro to React. Like the changes are minor, like if you watch the older videos, you should be just fine. Everything generally works the same, but there's, you know, some nuances I want to make sure I capture on this go round. So in this first video, what I want to do is really kind of like just talk about like what is React and like how to think about it conceptually. So React is in the same category as other libraries such as Vue, Svelte, Angular, Solid.js. These are all what's called a front-end JavaScript framework. So their job is to help you build your user interface. So they're front end, meaning they're building the visual piece of your website and the logic around the front end of your website, because nowadays like what's going on visually is very dependent on data that's within our application, our state. um, and in the old days, doing it what's called imperatively. So imperative coding is when you actually sit there and describe exactly what's happening step by step by step. So saying, okay, let's take this piece of the page and change this, and when this data changes, let's get rid of the old one and replace it with the new one with the new data. And you'd have to kind of describe all these steps individually or imperatively. Okay, basically what's going to happen with React and all these other frameworks is you begin describing your user interface declaratively, okay, generally using components. So declarative just means instead of describing how you do each step, the React framework or the Vue or Svelte or Solid.js framework, they know how to construct the UI. You just need to tell them what they need to construct. And generally the way this goes is that you're going to first create little building blocks called components. Okay, so instead of me just creating like one big web page with a bunch of HTML, and then in the HTML I describe what's happening on this page, what's going to happen is that instead maybe I create one little isolated block that's like the header of my page. Okay, and then uh, I create like another block or another little like piece that's like something as simple as like the body. So we'll say like, this is the main part of my page. And these are called components, these little building blocks. And these building blocks can have other building blocks inside of them. So maybe in my header, we have maybe our navigation, which is made up of a bunch of buttons. So we may have like a little button component that we create, and we may use that component multiple times. Okay, and the idea is that we're starting to build our application, and I don't have to actually rewrite all the code for the button because I can just reuse that button over and over again. And that's the beauty of like this component-based architecture. So now when I build the website, once I have all these components built, I just have to tell it that, hey, I want my header here, the main block here, inside the header there's going to be these buttons. I just declare what exists, and React will just build it. Okay, so that's the beauty of like sort of component-based design. On top of it, okay, it'll manage it. We're able to tie all these components to our data, which we'll refer to as state. Okay, state just means like, for example, you have state, right? Like you might be in a happy state. So whenever you are in a happy state, you have a smile on your face. Or if you are in a sad state, you suddenly have a frown on your face. Okay, so that state, like your actual happiness or sadness, isn't something that I can see. It's a thing that's kind of going on in your head, but your face, your UI, your user interface, that's how other people interact with you. It that UI changes based on what's going on in your internal state. Same thing with your app. What's going on visually may change based on sort of like the data, the internal state of the app. And usually we would have to code how that happens. So we have to say, okay, the data changes, and then change it this way, this way, this way, this way, this way. What we're going to do is through our components, we're going to be describing sort of like how the UI should look relative to state. So saying like, if happy, put a smile. If sad, put a frown. Okay, and then anytime the state changes, all these components are going to rebuild themselves, and then they'll reflect whatever the current data is. In this case, you don't have to manage your UI. You just create the components. You focus on updating your state, and your UI should always be up to date, reflecting your state. And that's sort of like the benefit of using React. So that just to kind of get that out of the way. So like, why do we care about this? What is the benefit here? It makes our life a lot easier. There's more to it, but that's the basic idea. The idea is that it's going to make it really easy to kind of create these building blocks, components, and then those building block components can then manage themselves based on the data that they use, because React will allow us to tie our UI to state, our components to a changing state. Okay, cool. So now that we've kind of established like what React is and what it cares, again, this is not backend, just to kind of reiterate that. React is not a back-end framework, so it's not handling like server-side routing or anything like that. Now, there are frameworks built on top of React that add some back-end elements like Next.js or Remix or Gatsby, um, which is more of a static site generator, but they add aspects that would exist in the backend world, a little more exposure to the backend. But the React library itself mainly just handles the rendering of your front end UI. So now that we got that out of the way, let's actually start setting up a project. So in this first video, we'll just set up the actual React project that we'll be using to learn from during these lessons. Okay, so I'm just going to open up a empty folder. I'm using Visual Studio Code. So in order to learn React, you're going to need an editor. I have Visual Studio Code. It's free, so I recommend the same one. You also need to make sure you have Node.js installed. So if you don't have Node.js installed, head over to nodejs.org and install Node.js. So you're going to open up Visual Studio. Okay, so here's Visual Studio Code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the terminal here in Visual Studio Code. Okay, let me just close this extra terminal over here. And what I am going to do is create a new React project. The simplest way to do it is you just do npx, which is a command for Node that allows you to run like one-time use tools. And the particular tool we're going to use is called create react app. Okay, and I'm going to add the latest flag. This way we make sure we're always using the newest version of create react app. Okay, and then after that we put a name for our projects. We'll call this, React 18 intro. Okay, and then I'm going to run that, and that's going to create a new React project. So you see like a new folder just got created in here. So that is going to be the project that we're working on. It'll take a moment for this to generate. So I will pause the video in the meantime. Okie dokie. Now that that's done, what I'm going to want to do is I want to open this folder. Notice that it's green. This is because basically React actually, when it creates your new React project, it does automatically make that a Git repository. So you don't have to actually create a new Git repository in the folder. It'll already exist when we create React app creates the project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this folder. Okay, so I'm going to click on open folder, which would be the same on Mac or Windows or Linux. On Mac, you're probably going to have to click, there's just be the command called open, and you'll select the folder. So I'll click open folder, and I'm going to open up React 18 course. Actually, no, in there, I want to open up React 18 intro. So that way, my Visual Studio Code is open directly to the project. That's just going to make it a little bit easier for us to work with. Okay, and if you're wondering where you probably do not have this VS Code folder, that's because I have a Visual Studio Code extension called Peacock that creates this to add those colors to my Visual Studio Code. So don't be alarmed that you don't see that on your code. Okay, cool. So let's give you a tour of what you see here. Okay, there is a README that just kind of has like a lot of like the default React, basically, which commands to run and things like that. For those who are familiar with Node, this is package.json, which is going to list all the dependencies that are currently installed in this project. Okay, there's actually a lot more, but it's all wrapped in this React scripts project. That way, this doesn't get too cluttered. If for some reason you really wanted to see like everything that's going on under the hood, then that's when you can run this command, the eject command. And then that'll actually reveal what's really going on under the hood, so you can customize it. I would just save that for, advanced purposes. Okay, these are our scripts. These are the different commands we can run. So whenever we want to work on the project and see it in development mode, we'll be running this start command, as you'll see later on. Okay, build is whenever we're like done with the project and we want to build the final product to deploy. Usually we don't have to do this ourselves, because usually we're going to use tools like Vercel or Netlify to deploy our project, which will detect that and kind of do that stuff for us. And React does have some testing libraries built into it, so if you want to take advantage of it and write tests, we would run those tests using the test command. Okay, aside from that, that's pretty much what's important in this file. Package lock, that's something you can ignore. It's there, but really 90% of your work is going to be in this source folder. The public folder is just a place to put like images, and really the main thing does is it holds the index.html. So it's really, again, when you're working with React by itself and not using something like Next or Remix, you're creating what's called a single page application. Literally the whole website's one page. So instead of going to different HTML files every time a user clicks a link to a different page on the website, what's going to be happening is that we will, through our changing of the application state, instead that we're going to use JavaScript to change what is being shown on the web page. So it's really just one web page, but it may feel like many web pages because JavaScript is changing what is visually on the screen. So JavaScript is essentially running the show now. HTML doesn't disappear, but it theoretically is really playing a lot less of a role. Okay, so that's what's going on here. So essentially what really matters here is that there's this div with the ID of root. Okay, it doesn't have to be a div and it doesn't have to be the ID of root, but this is the way that the default React project is set up. Because what happens is that in the main file that kickstarts the JavaScript, which is this index.js here, what happens is that we take that div with the ID of root and we're going to turn it into a root object. So you see React DOM create root. This means like when React renders content, okay, so when you say, hey, React, render this component and that component, where is that going to happen? Inside that div. So we're saying, hey, this is the root of the application. Okay, so in that root, so in that div that was in the HTML, we're going to render this. Okay, and which is React.strict mode, which is just something that basically turns on like JavaScript strict mode. You don't have to really worry about that. And then here we see the main component that's going to encompass our application called app. Okay, so again, remember I said we build building blocks? These are how those building blocks look like. They look like HTML tags. This is actually not HTML. It's like a special way of writing your UI that looks like HTML called JSX. Okay, JavaScript XML. Okay, again, really all it is just a way to, instead of having to like, because the actual underlying code that's actually happening is JavaScript, and what's going on, if you had to write that, no one would use React. So what they do is they give you this nice HTML-like syntax called JSX, and then under the hood, it uses a tool called Babel. When we run that build command, it's going to read all that JSX and then translate it to the equivalent JavaScript to express what we're doing. So that's essentially, so all we need to do is just know how to write JSX. That's all we care about. Okay, but essentially that's what's happening. So just to kind of recap, then here we have this application component, and notice like this is a component, and notice what a component is. A component is just literally a function. So it's a function like any other function. You can have all the code you want in it like any function. The only rule is that the function must return JSX. That's what makes it a component. Any function can be a component if it returns JSX. So you see it's essentially returning a block of HTML. Okay? If it's a function that returns a string, not a component. If it's a function that returns another function, not a component. A component has to return JSX. Because essentially what's happening is that when React reads this, essentially what it's saying is like to run that function, the app function, and then where we see this, replace that with the HTML that's returned by that component. So we go back to here, that gets replaced with this. Okay, and again, if we go back to the index.html we saw over here, this div gets replaced with that app component. So let's actually see this at work. So if I open up the terminal and I type in npm start, that's how I run the start command. All the other commands would have to be npm run command name. So npm run build, npm run test, npm run so forth. So we run npm start. Okay, and that starts the application. It's going to open up the browser. And we're going to see like the default React screen, which is this screen right here. Okay, and that's technically the code that we see in the app.js. Okay, so that's what this is. I could take out everything in the div and just make the div an empty div, like literally just delete all this stuff in the app.js. Okay, and now it's a blank page. And I can just literally write HTML in here. Okay, so I write like h1 hello world. Isn't that kind of cool, writing HTML in the middle of your JavaScript files? That's really neat. That's called JSX. Okay, there's a bunch of rules with JSX. We'll go over that in the coming videos, but just kind of show you, essentially, this is a component, this is a building block, and you can build as many building blocks as you want. Okay, but that's React. Essentially, we can run our application, which is what we're doing now. And as I make changes, I can see the updates in the browser. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this up to GitHub. So I'm going to create a new repository on github.com, so that way you can actually see what the code looks like at the end of each of these videos. So you can watch me do that. Let's create this like React 18 intro. Okay, create repository. Then I'm going to copy this URL. Okay, head back to VS Code. We're going to do git remote add origin, paste the URL. And then I can just do a git add to add all these files. Do a git commit to make a commit. Video 1. And then we're going to do a git push origin main to push that code up to GitHub. Okay, and at the end of each of these videos, we'll make a branch, and at the end of the video, I'll push up the branch so that way you can actually see the branches as you go, as we watch the video. So with that, I'll see you all in the next video. Have a great one and enjoy.